event because I always show up at meetings at the BPAW that will present later today at like 1 minute after the official starting time. And I walk in and everyone has begun and they stare at me like I was 15 minutes late. So this is, you can see this is more relaxed. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Open Philology, Global Philology Project. First though, let me just point out to you, those of you who are first-time visitors, where we are. This is Augustusplatz outside the main drag here in Leipzig. And we are in a church-like structure that was in fact a church from probably 1100, something like that, when this is a monastery. After Martin Luther decided he would reorganize things, it remained a church, though no longer in the Catholic Church. And it was preserved and survived the 30 Years' War. It survived the Titanic Battle of Leipzig, which was as big a battle as had ever happened in human history. It was like the Battle of Gettysburg as a reference point for Americans. And it survived the visit of the British Air Force on December 3rd, 1943, when they firebombed the Grafisches Viertel over there, the printing quarter, and took out 80% of it. And people came out of their homes and pulled burning pieces of wood off of this church to preserve it, risking their lives. And in one day in 1968, Walter Ulbricht, the father of the DDR, walked out of the opera house there, came out and said, well, looked at his beautiful then Karl Marx Platz with a hotel and the big MDR Tower, which was the university, and various other buildings. And then there was this old church. And he said, "Das Ding muss weg." You know, in English, that thing's got to go. I don't know how you, the idiomatic way of saying that in other languages. A week later, it was dynamited. Pictures of that were taken clandestinely down from the green space over there. And then something hideous was put up, a gigantic bronze bas-relief of Marx and Lenin with the peoples of the world was hung over the entrance of this hideous building. That enormous bas-relief still exists, and it's another part of the city. Maybe if we have dinner at Schraber's tomorrow, we can go look at it. It's kind of interesting. And then after the Wende, then the major fall of East Germany happened in part because of demonstrations here, outside this here that began in Augustusplatz. One of the great moments you've never heard of in your world history happened in October 1989, when the East German police did not fire as they were intended to do. And they were intended to impose the Beijing, the Chinese solution, as it was called, and it didn't happen. Later, this building was rebuilt with a church inside, much to the dismay of the Red Sox, by which I do not mean my baseball team in Boston. The Roten Socken are the communist professors who didn't want no damn church in this university. But it was built anyway. It still doesn't work as far as I can tell. We've been working on it indefinitely. This is a building in which Bach played and Mendelssohn played. This is the building, the church where Mendelssohn's funeral was held. And we are the first people also to have been able to study Greek and Latin here since the British bombing of 1943. We have a chair of Greek, a chair of Latin, ancient history, but they're a mile away. And so I consider this to be all context, which is part of how we think about the past, the present, and the future, and how we think about global philology. Because what we do is not simply ways for more people to write cleverer articles to impress other experts. It is the job of scholars to understand and advance civilization with a capital C. Now, in the old days, advancing civilization meant you do things my way. I think now I would say advancing civilization means you don't blow up churches or cut people's heads off. I think let's start with that. And I think we can do a lot along those lines. And global philology really is one of my personal feelings is that it's not just the production of knowledge in some disembodied form, whether print or digital, but the practice of scholarship as a way of exchanging ideas with your friends and colleagues and new friends and new colleagues, not only within your own language and culture, but across boundaries of language and culture. And that very inquiry, when performed in a respectful fashion, advances the ties that knit human beings around the world together. And global philology, if it will do anything, it will advance this communication, this respectful and mutually enriching discussion. And I say, it's easy if you are a citizen of the country, of which I'm a citizen, which I will not name, with a president who I will not name. It would be easy to be a little depressed right now or a little discouraged by how things go. And I always tell people, we live in the city of heroes, as it's called, a center that defied tyranny. And I defy anyone to look out in that square and think about what happened there, and to look at where Germany is, and the role that Germany plays, which isn't perfect, but which is pretty good. And I say, you're not allowed to be pessimistic. You're allowed to be realistic, but you're not allowed to think, at least with me, that we're not going anywhere and we can't do anything. That's just simply not acceptable in this city. It's a very inspiring place to be, and I hope you feel a little of that in your time here. Now, okay, let me start with some context for the Global Philology Project. And, you know, I every so often in meetings, I would say, humanities in Germany, we have to defend the humanities. And good friends of mine, people I really like, would lean back and say, it's never been better for the humanities in Germany. You know, all the numbers, everything, it's great. That's your problem, you Anglo-Saxons. We have it, it's not a problem here. And I actually was a little befuddled, and I'll give you some context to this. And here is an article, and it is a genre of article, a publication in German, which is why all those English speakers, you know, are behind us, really, and we're really cool, which is often, unfortunately, too true. I could argue even. Attack on free thinkers. Angriff auf die freien Denker. Universitäten in Japan, Großbritannien und den Vereinigten Staaten verabschieden sich von ihren Geisteswissenschaften, hält Deutschland dagegen. So universities in Japan, England, Great Britain, and America say goodbye to their humanities. Does Germany stand up against that? Way to pose, of course they do. That's where that's going. And they talk about the decline in humanities enrollments and so on in the USA and England and Japan. But of course, the point is, between 2005 and 2014, the number of humanities majors in German universities grew from 420,000 to 500,000. And I believe the number of students declined in that period, because I think we have declining population. And I didn't check that. But basically, you have a 20% increase in the number of humanities majors in Germany in 9 years. So that's, you know, pretty clear overall. However, and at the same time, it's a good time to be a professor in Germany, or to be an academic in Germany, at least in theory, because the number of professorships has increased between 1999 and 2015, a 15-year period, by 20%. Now, mind you, 80% of the positions in German higher education are not professorships, they're not permanent. But if you have but the number of these coveted positions has increased over a 15-year period by a substantial amount. But if we come back home to our neck of the woods, to the kind of things we work on, which would be in here, Alte Kulturen und Sprachen, things aren't so good. Between 1997 and 2015 in Germany, while the number of professorships are growing, the number of professorships in ancient cultures and languages declined from about 200 to about 157. A decline of 27% in less than 20 years. In the report, this isn't a report on kleine Fächer. In the report, I love it, the Germans have the expression of, diese Fächer stehen im Abbau. They're being dismantled, and in a rather catastrophic fashion. It's not so good either with problematic with other languages. At the same time, conversely, if you look at one study, this is the most recent study I could find, but I think it still represents the world as it is. Here is a study of some leading English language journals in different disciplines and the languages that are cited. In philosophy, nobody cites anything but English. Literally, 98% of the citations, 99% are just English. In history, German gets about 3%. So in other words, that means that if people are writing about Central European history, they'll cite German sources. In literature, which is the biggest field in the humanities, Germanistic is the biggest field in Germany by enrollments by far. English is second, ahead of history. In literature, people only cite English and French. So there are 11% of the citations are in French. And basically, there's as many random citations of German as there are of Latin. In other words, German is not, people who work on literature in the English-speaking world don't read German scholarship. Religion has about 9% of the citations point to German. Art, about 7%, but it's classics that has over 10% of the citations, and that is the strongest field. So in other words, the ancient languages and cultures are those areas where scholarship in German is most prominent in English-speaking, at least in English-speaking publications. So if you want to enhance your profile as a German scholarship in this sort of Anglophone world, it's the ancient languages that are your best bet, and you don't want them to decline. But even here, the situation is not good. Back in 1957, a third of the citations in one leading classics journal, American classics journal, a third pointed to German. 30 years later, this is roughly when I was born and when I got my first job, that had declined to 24%. And I correlated that by looking myself at another journal, and I got 22.5%. So that's probably a valid number. And if you go into the 21st century, you have a continued decline. We're down to 10%, what we saw before. And so this is, we have two problems. We have the decline of these ancient languages and cultures and professorships, and at the same time, a decline in people using German language scholarship outside, at least in the English-speaking world. If you lose more chairs, you lose the place where you have real potential to be heard, and you want to do something to address the visibility of German. By the way, if you think it's because German professors are writing in English, I actually went and studied that, and in classical philology, Greek and Latin, 90% of the publications by chairs are in German versus English. In ancient history, it's 97%. In cuneiform and Egyptology, it's 80%, 20% English. So they're a bit more balanced. So I went a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, this January 2016, to Bonn, to the BAM-BF, to talk to them about this. And I said, look, we got these problems. Now I got to say, Germany is awesome, because I had gone to Washington and said, well, look, we declined from 200 to 160 chairs of ancient cultures and languages. And I told my senator that. My senator, or probably the staffer who would represent the senator to me, would probably make a note and say, wow, we still have 160 of these chairs we haven't gotten rid of yet. Think of what we could do with STEM, with MINT disciplines. But when I went to Germany, to Bonn, and talked to the ministry, they were genuinely concerned. And they recognized this as a challenge. They wanted to do something to help. And I thought that was wonderful myself. So I asked them I said, look, I want to go, and I also think there are great things happening in the big infrastructure projects, Clarin, Daria, Europeana, but they're not filtering into the needs of my colleagues as they see it in these ancient languages and cultures. I think a lot of the work goes to the big national languages. That's not saying that nothing useful is happening, but it's not, we haven't gotten a lot of our core needs met yet. And again, and I said, I want to identify what actually is available that we didn't know about. Think about as much work as we can that's going on in Germany, in Europe, and anywhere else. And really try to get the best scholarship together, the best work that's happened, and see if we can pull that together and enhance it. And so, you know, I didn't know how much, and I'll tell you what the budget is because it's revealing. I didn't know how much to ask for. At the Mellon Foundation, you get $50,000 to start up. At the National Science Foundation, you get $25,000. So you get these little planning grants. And nobody would tell me what I should ask for with the BAM-BAF. And so I said, well, what about $30,000? And somebody said, oh, that's a lot of money. So I put together a budget for 65,000 euros for a bunch of workshops. And I got email back, you know, heard back from the BAM-BAF, and they said, no, that 65,000 doesn't make any sense to us. And I said, okay, I've been in this business for 30 years. Give me my 30,000. I asked for 65, you give me 32. I know how this works. And I'll figure out, we'll make this happen. They said, no, 65,000 isn't gonna work. We're gonna give you 150,000 instead. Okay, I think I can work with this. This is the kind of change, you know, I can deal with. And I say that just because I'm so impressed with the seriousness of the support that we have been offered. And you know, my inference is that hopefully we have a possibility of securing substantial resources for an implementation phase. We have no guarantees. We're not going to write a proposal just to ask for money. We're going to look to see what we need to do. But I think there's a real chance that Germany will be able to support substantial work that will help scholarship in Germany, but also will be useful to everybody else. And that is my goal. We have a bunch of workshops. One thing that I really want to avoid is the summit problem. So one of the things, I probably shouldn't say this when it's being recorded, but when you see, you know, there's a Digital Humanities Summit that's happening, it almost always means that these are your friends that you're inviting, or it's the people you funded. And I've been on the outside of too many of those summits in the past. So we put out a call, an open call, so that anyone who wanted would be able to submit a proposal and talk about their work, because we're absolutely determined to do our best to get the best survey of what's happening out there so that we can assess what exists, what doesn't exist, and we don't end up just talking to the people we already know, which is the easy thing to do. So thank you all very much for submitting and putting your work forward and coming here to participate in this conversation. I really appreciate it. So we have a bunch of workshops, and we'll talk about these workshops presently, you know, after I finish this overview in a few minutes. There'll be some sort of final workshop in the summer and a proposal in September, something like that. You know, you'll notice Assyriology had a discipline-specific meeting because we've had digital Egyptology. We kind of assume that we are always in contact with Greek and Latin. And we're also, and Assyriology is sort of a big area in Germany. We're really interested in other smaller disciplines as well. Syriac, Zurich, classical Armenian, Coptic, and so on. The Coptic is part of Egyptology. Now let's shift and say, explain what I think it means, the way I use philology here. And philology means different things in different places. In theory, it is impossible to explain philology in English, and for that reason, the American Philological Association, my professional association, changed its name to the Society for Classical Studies, a deeply problematic choice. But I give here a definition that I first heard quoted to me when I was 17 years old, my first year in the university, by my professor, Cedric Hubble-Whitman, who was part of a tradition of Americans who either were trained in Germany or whose professors were trained in Germany. And I remember Cedric saying, philology is just, as August Burke said, was the cognitio, or the scientia totius antiquitatis. And 30 years later, I hunted down this quotation. And I think I got the source for it. It's not precise. I'm sure that's what I heard. But it is, the source I got came from the 1822 birthday oration that poor August Burke had to give every year to the King of Prussia. That must have been fun. And he said that philology is the universi antiquitatis cognitio historica et philosophica. So it is the cognitio. That is to say, is the understanding. It is the process of understanding in your brain, not something on a piece of paper and not in a computer file, but here. The understanding of the past, antiquitatis, let us say the ancient past. Universi, in its entirety. Philosophica et historica, or historica and philosophica, historica, everything out in the world, and philosophica, everything that happens in your brain. In other words, it is anything that you can do with the human textual record, linguistic record, to understand anything about any aspect of human history. It includes editing texts. It includes writing commentaries. It includes various practices, but these are subsets of an open-ended, expansive, and unbounded set of tasks which are subordinate to this grand challenge. And a grand challenge which can and must adapt at all times to the best possible methods from whatever disciplines are available to us. There is no compromise and no justification for saying this is how we do it, because this is how we do it, in my view. And this is, not everyone looks at it this way, but this is where I'm coming from. So that more or less says that. Three reasons. There are three basic reasons for global philology, and there are social, political, economic, intellectual, and pragmatic. Economic, social, and political contexts. And so I always tend to go back and forth between a German and an American context. I was in Canada and gave a talk, and I got criticized for not talking about the Canadian point of view. I can't even understand these 2 points of view. So I use these because these are the two countries of which I am a legal resident. So but it should be, you should think about it for your own countries. How do we understand our cultural heritage in your country within an increasingly globalized world where other regions outside of our own region, wherever it is, are also economically advanced and technologically capable? I.e., there is a world beyond the world of English, French, German, and Italian, the four languages, traditional languages of classical scholarship. Now, in the United States, you can see, by our exports, roughly how we relate to the world, and it's kind of balanced. We're an island power in between everybody else. Germany, very different. Germany is really wired into Europe in a way that the United States is not. And again, you always have to think about what is the economic basis of your country if you're trying to understand what your country is likely to support or what you're dealing with. But it's, of course, not all about trade and economics. It's about population. Here is a population figure, projections from the Pew Charitable Trust from about a year ago. And this is a slide I've been using since well over a year. And if the trends present in 2015 were to continue for the next 50 years, the United States would have no majority, or will have no majority ethnic group. We will become a really globalized society. Now, what happens if it's, so for me, 2065, I hope I'm not still around in 2065, because I'm probably going to be a brain in a bucket, I guess, at that point. But, if you were starting out, if you were 20 years old, 50 years from now is not so far away. You're likely to be, you may well still be functioning and working at that point. And do you want, what is classics going to mean? What should classics mean in a society that is adapting? And we can see a lot of what's happening in the United States reflects anxiety by some people at this process. And I think that anxiety will pass, frankly. A lot of that anxiety is where people have least experience with the realities of an increasingly complicated ethnic composition. But this is the challenge, I think, in the United States, is to think about the past and to think about classics, not just as Greek and Latin, but as classical Greek, classical Latin, classical Chinese, classical Arabic, classical Persian, Sanskrit, and in fact, any language of the past, and not to be restricted. And I believe that is the perspective that remains strong where I am and that will prevail. In Germany, and I should say also, bizarrely, the American population is increasing. So I'm not sure why our Social Security is going to collapse, but the American population is slated to grow by a third in the next 50 years, which I don't understand what's going on. But in Germany, as many of you know, in terms of demographic change, we have a choice between radical depopulation and catastrophic depopulation. And I believe we need 1 million people a year to maintain our population. And they're not all coming from Italy and Poland. They're going to come from someplace else. And so, or we have a real challenge. So here, how do you manage this? What do you do about this? And so it's a different kind of challenge than the United States has. And we have, here there are real debates, and it's an honest question. I don't know what the best way to move forward for Germany is. I'm certainly not going to criticize Germany, given what's happening in my country. But I'll just say that I use the term multiculti in the United States. I probably would get fired. It's a different kind of language. And anyway, so how do you fashion a culture that integrates immigrants culturally as well as economically? How do you have a culture where you bring new people in and they are able to engage with the existing culture while contributing at the same time in a way that strengthens everyone in a reasonable fashion? Again, I can't answer that for Germany. And I'm predisposed towards this habit of thought, this kind of a system that I grew up with. Now so you want to have a global philology because your countries, one way or the other, are dealing with population immigrants and dealing with people around the world, whether they're receiving immigrants from there or not, with whom we are interacting in real time economically and in other ways as well. Now, there are also intellectual motivations. And I would say it is the long tail. One of the big impacts of digitization is that we have access to far more cultural products than we ever had before. We see this already commercially. We see this in Amazon. We see this in iTunes. We see this in Netflix. We see this in the various streaming services. And what has been discovered is that when you have infinite inventories, people don't just look at bestsellers. They don't just look at the top films. Half of traffic goes to songs, books, movies, whatever, that individually are not much used. But in the aggregate, this is half of your business. That's commercial. Intellectually, you should expect the same thing, that we now are seeing become increasingly visible vast digital collections, millions of digitized books. But you have to expect that real human curiosity is going to go spread out within this space beyond the canon, beyond the stuff that we've studied, because that kind of availability changes patterns. And the question is, what on earth are you going to do with this? So here's an example of something I bumped into a few months ago when I was preparing this talk. I put these slides together the morning before I gave this talk, and I just picked out some symphony on YouTube. And suddenly I found a bunch of composers that I confess I actually never heard of, that were not in my repertoire. And I started to listen to them, and I said, what do I do with this? And how do I contextualize this fabulous thing that I never would have been able to find in the best vinyl record store 30 years ago? How do I, that's a tantalizing thing, but I want to know more. And obviously you can do incredible things. I mean, I have very little patience with people running down Wikipedia, which is as good as any encyclopedia I ever used. I can now go find basic information about someone, and usually it's accurate, and I could never do this in the same way, in the old days. It's a big advance. And I'd like to ask a bunch of questions. I won't go into them, but there's a bunch of critical contextualizing questions I would pose. And this is a challenge of global philology. Someone sees a book in classical Armenian. I just get depressed. That's not good enough. Someone sees a pamphlet in it in your native language from 300 years ago, but you don't know anything about that context. How do you change that? That is the challenge, a grand challenge of philology, and we have to be able to support any arbitrary language from any arbitrary culture that anyone is likely to confront. That's the intellectual, that is what our job is as scholars, making other people smart, not showing how smart we are. All right, and you see lots of instances where people pick up on, address intellectual challenges where they simply can't get at the primary sources. Here, the Stanford Ancient Chinese and Mediterranean Empires project dealing with ancient Greek, classical Chinese, Latin, Coptic, Syriac, and God knows what else. I mean, all of those of you who can work with all those languages, raise your hands. And if you don't, if you do, I'll hate you because I'd be so jealous. I mean, this is, and maybe you can do this. But then let's look here. Here's a course taught by my colleague Karen Radner, when she was still in the UK with a colleague of hers, on Assyrian and ancient Greek military practices. I guarantee you virtually no one in that class could read Greek and Akkadian, as well as French, Italian, German, English. How do you support that? How do you get people so that they can work with the primary materials? Likewise, Greco-Arabic studies, ancient Greek, classical Arabic, scholastic Latin, and the usual, or here, world literature. The way you study world literature is you learn English and read everything in English translation. I mean, that's a necessity, that's practical, I understand the reasons for it, but it still makes me want to break down and cry as a philologist, because that's not everything I believe in. It's just, it's a terrible accommodation to necessity. So how do you deal with all these languages? And there are methods to deal with it. Here is what we call the Leipzig glossing rules. And essentially, if you have time, and this is what linguists do, so they can work with hundreds or thousands of languages, you take a text and you analyze every word, you give the morphology, you give all the morphemes, you give the translation, you give people the infrastructure so that they can do something with that source text. And linguists do this already. It's been done for lots of modern languages, and it's been done for ancient Egyptian. Big kudos to my colleagues, in Berlin. We have another, I think we'll hear, are the Rosetta Stone people here yet?
No. They had to cancel.
They had to cancel?
Yeah, they had to cancel. Unfortunately, this morning they canceled, so we won't be actually hearing from them.
Okay, well then this is here is the Rosetta Stone. It would have saved people a lot of trouble if they had this. Here is a complete linguistic publication of the language of the Rosetta Stone. So you can work with it. This If you have this, it's, reading this is not the same thing as having internalized demotic Egyptian, obviously, but it's a whole different thing from staring at a bunch of text you cannot read at all. It is a transformative thing. And we do this by using things like morphosyntactic annotation. Here's an XML serialization that looks like this when you represent it as a tree. And essentially, if you know a little bit about how this grammar works, no matter what language you've got, you can figure out how the words work. You can figure out what's going on in this sentence. If you put this together with an aligned translation, Sam, I think I may have your work up here. And you can see the words that are orange are words that don't have correspondence in the Greek. The words that are black have been lined up. You can visualize this data also in an interlinear way. So if you can line up all the words in a translation with the source text, provide syntax and morphology for every word, have a dictionary, guess what? You can do a lot with that text. You really open up the languages in a way that was not feasible before. The question is scalability. How do you do this when you have 100 million words of Greek and Latin? Or 1 billion counting words and counting words of post-classical Latin? It's really billions and billions. You can't do it all by hand. How do we automate this in a reasonable way? How do we go? So this by itself, the Greco-Roman world, circa 200 CE, is hard enough with English, French, German, Italian. What about Arabic and Turkish? The language most commonly spoken in that red space today is not German, it's not Italian, it's not French, it's Arabic. Number 2 is Turkish. How do you connect with the people, support the study of the Greco-Roman world for the people who actually live there outside of Europe? And again, this is the world we really need to think about. The world as a system. We may not ourselves deal with everything, but we need to think about how we allow people to move from materials from the entire universe at any given time. Something which is physically, intellectually impossible with traditional print tools. So finally, I'll finish up. Pragmatic issues. It's really hard to hire good developers. You cannot pay wages in the German academic system that will attract people monetarily to be developers. You just don't pay enough. And you can't, it's hard to build a system which says, be a monk and sacrifice financially for your family and work for us and serve society. You will get people who do it, but it's not a good way of running a business. And so one thing we can do is we can hire contract programming. We can contract professionals if we define the task properly and get around the limitations of getting reliable stuff. By the way, if you get good, we've also lost people to industry. So you start as an ancient historian and you end up in a internet startup in Berlin, making twice as much money and having lots of fun. So it's not such a bad thing as a career path. And I want to talk about categories of code. One of the most important categories of development are what I would call project development, project-oriented code solutions that are just good enough to solve the needs of a single short and medium-term project, but that will often capture the actual needs of the community in a way that something produced by a professional may not. It's a real problem working with computer scientists. If you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. They do things one way. Code that we produce that may be ugly code can be incredibly important because of the statement it makes about what matters, especially when other people recognize it. Research code, this is what computer scientists will often do when they're writing papers. Research code, you write a code good enough so you can write an article, so you can run a test and get some measurements on how effective your algorithm is, how fast it is, whatever it is. But you don't bother documenting the code or writing it in a way that another human being can understand it. And so this also is really important. And what we need is reusable code. And 40 years ago, Fred Brooks in the Mythical Man Month said reusable code costs 3 times as much as good single-purpose codes. In other words, when you've got something that works and you think it's great and you think you're finished, you finish 25% of the work needed so that somebody else could take your code and reuse it. And if nobody lives forever, somebody's got to take their code and reuse it. So these are things that we think about in this. And infrastructure, I don't really know what the hell infrastructure is. People use it all the time, usually as a magical incantation to get money. But for me, my functional understanding of infrastructure is when somebody else who doesn't care about your subject reliably takes over a service and runs it after you're dead without really understanding what you're doing. So libraries are the classic memory institutions at universities, and it is my hope that they will evolve to be even more helpful. And they're doing a pretty good job here in Germany, I've got to say. So back to the German perspective and the possible German initiative. We're running out of time. We should get to talk about other things. So let me just skip over these for now to what we've said. Interesting thing, what's happening is this, what are the skills for 21st century philology? They include new ways of thinking about text, corpus linguistics, text mining and visualization, data science, etc. If you say, my texts are perfect, my print texts are perfect, your texts have errors, you don't really understand how data works. You need to think differently. We had a little conversation about this, a heated conversation in Potsdam last week. I questioned, what will be the languages of scholarly publication? For me, it was clearly English, French, German, and Italian. And maybe it still would be if I were 18, but not if I had a lot of imagination. What are the languages of humanities scholarship going to be 20 years, 30 years from now? I think it's going to be a different configuration. I think you have to think in terms of Arabic, Chinese, English, and Spanish to pick 4. Maybe there's some others, but not just the languages of 19th century Europe. That's obviously not acceptable. And how do we balance deep expertise in one field with the need to be able to think critically about sources in dozens, if not hundreds, of languages? And what might emerge from the planning phase? We don't know yet. We'll decide. But probably not. We're not going to build new services. So if you say, if only we had a new service X that doesn't exist, that's not what we're going to do. We're not going to say, look to support research that the DFG or somebody else would fund otherwise. Again, it's not what we would do. And it's not for working on services that still support only one project or institution. So if you say, my institution built this great thing for my project that works for my students, but nobody else is using it, you haven't made the compelling case yet. But that's something that should be invested in this phase, in this kind of work. What we are looking at, support to build on what has been done, to document and generalize existing services across disciplines, complete rewrite and generalization of compelling research code. I can think of one critical system I won't describe, I won't identify, that would win, that could be, I would nominate for a Nobel Prize in Greek literature. And when you actually get into the code, I'm told it is a nightmare that will make you go crazy. The service is brilliant, the implementation is not comprehensible. So in that case, what we have is a spec. This is what the service does. We know this is important. We then hired professional programmers to rewrite this in a way that third parties could understand. That's something we would want to fund. There's a lot of work like that out there. I've done some of it myself. My old work on morphology fits into that. Pilot work on new work enabled by demanding global philology. So maybe a hyperlingual edition, an edition that has texts in Greek, Syriac, Classical Armenian, Arabic, Georgian, a range of languages well beyond what any one scholar could manage themselves. And new institutional configurations to support global philology. How do we institutionally organizes. These are the things we're probably going to provide. And we have work we do, we see as models. I'll skip over that. And I'll finish by pointing out that one thing that's clear is that our philology is really data science. I find it completely, these are the 5 core courses for data science at Berkeley. And they consist of research design and application for data and analysis, statistics for data analysis, storing and treating data, applied machine learning, data visualization and communication. That's philology in a digital age. And if you are good at that and you get tired of working on Greek and Latin or classical Arabic or Egyptology or cuneiform studies, I don't know why you would, but if you did, starting salary in the US is $100,000. So it's a pretty good fallback. So what we do, ironically, is incredible. It plugs into the needs of society, which is why we have the humanities law. Because at least in England, the humanists became prominent because they provided the king with people who could think in terms of databases, who could think in terms of print databases to run a nation state. And the study of Greek and Latin was a proxy for acquiring state-of-the-art information technology skills to run what became a modern centralized state. And that's why we started. That's why it was as a proxy to find smart people that we had Greek and Latin in the English-speaking world. And to some extent, we can do the same thing again here when we think in terms of this global flood. Okay, that's enough.